The Oklahoma Panhandle is hiding something, and it starts with how this place came to exist. That skinny rectangle nobody can explain was once nobody's. Land no state or territory would claim for 40 years. Its arrow-straight southern edge isn't a survey line, it's where slavery was supposed to stop. And a farm wife near Eva wrote letters from here that taught the country what the Dust Bowl felt like. This isn't the state's forgotten corner. It's a frontier that plays by different rules and keeps landing at the center of America's biggest fights. These are 35 facts the Panhandle's been hiding, even from the people who live on it. Every one is real. Let's start with number 35, bombed by its own Air Force. Just after midnight on July 5, 1943, a B-17 crew mistook the courthouse square in Boise City for a practice range and bombed it. Boise City is the seat of Cimarron County, a grid of lights on an ocean of dark rangeland. The bomber had left Dalhart, Texas for a lighted target near Conlin, but the navigator, a young lieutenant named John Daly, steered it more than 40 miles off course, and the 4 lights around the courthouse looked close enough. The crew dropped 6 practice bombs into the middle of town, cratering the streets and blowing out windows. The bombs were mostly sand around a small charge, and by sheer luck, nobody was killed. It's one of only a handful of American towns bombed by its own military during World War II. Locals could have buried the story. Instead, they put a monument on the square so that a place most of the country couldn't find on a map would always own the night the war fell out of the sky by mistake. 34. Oklahoma's rooftop of lava. Ask anyone for Oklahoma's highest point, and they'll picture a green eastern mountain. It's actually a flat-topped mesa in the far northwest corner of Cimarron County, near Kenton, called Black Mesa, 4,973 feet above sea level. And it isn't a peak at all. That summit is capped by a sheet of dark basalt, lava that poured across an ancient river system a few million years ago. Once it hardened, the rock shielded everything beneath it while the softer high plains around it wore down, leaving this table standing above the grass. The hike to the marker runs about 4.2 miles one way, through shortgrass, yucca, and the occasional pronghorn, past cliffs that expose sandstones and shales laid down back in the age of dinosaurs. From the top, you're standing more than 3,000 feet higher than downtown Oklahoma City, like stacking more than 2 Empire State Buildings on the plains. Most Oklahomans will never see it. Their state's true high point sits in the emptiest county they've got. 33. The lake that never filled. Just north of Hardisty, in Texas County, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built a dam 120 feet high and more than 3 miles long, and behind it sits almost no lake. You'd assume a structure that big holds a deep reservoir. Optima Lake was designed for 618,500 acre-feet of water and cost about $46 million. It has never held more than about 5% of that. The reason isn't a crack or a design flaw. As the dam was finishing in 1978, farmers upstream were pumping so hard from the Ogallala aquifer that they drained the Beaver River feeding it. The water the engineers counted on simply stopped arriving. For scale, a full Optima would have covered close to 1,000 square miles under a foot of water, roughly half the size of Delaware. Today, you can walk down boat ramps that end in dry grass and past picnic shelters that never saw a single angler. Senator Tom Coburn later mocked it in his waste book as federal waste, one of the only reservoirs in the plains where the dam outlived the river it was built to hold. 32. The 100th Meridian Divide. There's an invisible line running north to south through the Panhandle, and crossing it changes everything about the land. It's the 100th Meridian, the longitude geographers have used for over a century to mark where the humid eastern United States gives way to the dry west. The Oklahoma Panhandle is the only part of the state that sits west of it. Back in 1878, the explorer John Wesley Powell warned Congress that past this line, ordinary rain-fed farming would fail without irrigation. He was right. Average rainfall drops toward about 20 inches a year, roughly the difference between the climate of Kansas City and that of Amarillo, effectively half the water. Drive west across it on US 412, and you can watch it happen. The shelter belts thin out, and the center pivot sprinklers appear. Beaver, Texas, and Cimarron counties don't just feel drier than the rest of Oklahoma. By this old measure, they belong to a different half of the country. 31. The dinosaur boneyard. The dry pastures around Black Mesa graze cattle today, but they sit on rock more than 140 million years old, and it's full of dinosaurs. In 1931, a road crew grading US 64 east of Kenton cut into a bed of fossils, and University of Oklahoma geologist J. Willis Stovall came out to see it. From 1935 to 1942, Stovall's crews, many of them Depression-era WPA workers, opened 17 quarries across the Kenton area and hauled out more than 18 tons of bone. Apatosaurus, Stegosaurus, Diplodocus, and a giant meat eater. That predator, later named Saurophaganax, became Oklahoma's official state fossil, and much of the haul now sits in the Sam Noble Museum in Norman. Most of the fossil ground still isn't a park. It's working ranch land behind barbed wire, where bones weather out of draws between grazing cattle. You'd never guess it driving through. What looks like pure wind and short grass is one of the country's quiet dinosaur fields, and most of the record is still out there, waiting under the pasture. 30. The murdered marshal of Beaver City. Beaver City advertised itself as the only town where there is absolutely no law, and the killing of its own marshal proved it. The town was a cluster of saloons, brothels, and gambling tents about 3 miles south of present-day Liberal, Kansas, in what's now Beaver County. A piece of no man's land with no state, no territory, no court, and no law. Its marshal was a self-appointed strongman, remembered as Brushy Bush, who carried a sawed-off shotgun and ran the place as a protection racket, taxing the saloons at will. In the summer of 1888, after Bush beat a saloon madam known as Pussycat Nell over a disputed payment, she watched from her upstairs window and shot him as he passed, and other townspeople emptied their guns into him too, so no one man could be blamed. One newspaper later reported his body was found riddled with 74 bullets. No court ever heard the case, because there was none to hear it. Out here, even the man who called himself the law had none to protect him. That's fact 30. Quick thing before we keep going. The comments on these videos are genuinely the best part. So if there's something about the Panhandle I've missed, a town, a story, a place your family's from out here, put it down there. I read all of them. Okay, back to it. 29. Prairie that acts like mountains. Out on the flat short grass of the Western Panhandle, you can spot wildlife that belongs 1,000 feet up in the Rockies without a single tree in sight. You'd think Oklahoma wildlife means white-tailed deer and songbirds in the woods. West of the 100th Meridian, though, the Panhandle is high, cold, dry steppe, and it carries a western cast of characters instead. Pronghorn, the fastest land animal in North America, range across Cimarron and western Texas counties, the only wild pronghorn herd left in Oklahoma. Aerial surveys counted more than 2,000 of them in 2019, but the number has since fallen to around 800, a drop steep enough that the state launched a multi-year study to find out why. Overhead, ferruginous hawks, big raptors usually tied to the arid basins of the interior West, hunt the same ground squirrels and prairie dogs they'd chase in Wyoming. Much of this country sits above 3,000 feet, climbing past 4,000 near Black Mesa. High, cold, and windswept enough to feel like a different state. So a driver out here is watching mountain country animals on land flat to the horizon. 28. The rivers that sink underground. Here's one of the strangest things about the Panhandle. Some of its rivers disappear before they ever leave it. The Beaver River, called the North Canadian out here, is officially an intermittent river. Its bed is porous sand and gravel, and much of its water simply drains straight down into the Ogallala aquifer below. Follow it upstream from Optima Dam, and the river becomes a string of isolated pools and dry, braided sandbars. Over in the Western Panhandle, the Cimarron River runs so sandy that its upper stretch is literally called the Dry Cimarron. The drying got worse after the 1940s, when center pivot irrigation spread and wells started pulling water out faster than the rivers brought it in. A single high-capacity Ogallala well here can pump as much as 2,500 gallons a minute, about 3.6 million gallons a day, enough to empty more than 5 Olympic pools out of the ground every 24 hours. In wet years, these reaches briefly run bank to bank, which is why the state gambled on Optima here at all. So the water's still moving, it's just moving underground now, where a river used to be. 27. A desert in cattle country. About a mile north of the town of Beaver, on US 270, the pasture suddenly turns into sand dunes. Beaver Dunes Park protects around 300 acres of active bare sand hills inside a 520-acre park. A pocket desert dropped into the middle of shortgrass ranch land. These aren't beach dunes. High plains wind builds them, lifting sand out of old river and creek beds and piling it into ridges that shift and ripple over time. Elevations on the riding area run about 2,400 to 2,500 feet, and from the crests, you get broad views over the surrounding farm country. Stand up there, and the nearest trees and houses sit far off in every direction, leaving you on a sand island. The state actually tried to close the park in 2011 as a budget cut. The town of Beaver took it over that August to keep it open. Today, the dunes share space with campers and dune buggy riders. 300 acres of moving sand ringed on every side by working farms. 26. The Comanche ran no man's land. For about 25 years, the ground that became the Panhandle wasn't empty or lawless. It was controlled, just not by anyone in Washington. When Texas gave up this strip in the Compromise of 1850, it became federal land with no government of any kind. But that legal vacuum sat right on the western edge of Comancheria. From roughly 1850 to 1875, Comanche bands and their Kiowa, Cheyenne, and Ute allies used these grasslands as hunting range and a staging ground for raids into New Mexico and Texas. Traders on the Santa Fe Trail's Cimarron cutoff crossed the west end of the future Cimarron County, but they moved at the sufferance of those bands, not any sheriff. That control didn't end with a signature. It ended with the Army's Red River War of 1874 and 1875, which forced these nations onto reservations to the east. Only then did survey stakes and homestead law begin to replace a landscape that had answered to indigenous power for generations. 25. The county that feeds the nation. The stretch of highway from Guymon up to Hooker looks like nothing. Low horizons, a few grain elevators. It's actually one of the most concentrated meat-producing corridors in the plains. Texas County is packed with commercial feed yards, feed mills, and a giant pork plant. The Seaboard Foods plant in Guymon processes around 16,000 hogs a day and employs roughly 2,300 people, close to a fifth of the whole town. The cattle side is just as big. In 1953, a Panhandle rancher named Lad Hitch opened one of the first feedlots in the Southwest at Guymon, and the hitch yards grew to a capacity of around 160,000 head. Far from the only operation out here. On many days, there are more cattle standing in the pens around Guymon than there are people in the town, which has under 13,000 residents. Most viewers picture the Panhandle as scattered family ranches. In reality, the corridor from Guymon to Hooker runs like one continuous protein plant, quietly feeding supermarket shelves across the country. 24. The border drawn by slavery. Look at the Panhandle's arrow-straight southern edge, and it seems like a surveyor's arbitrary line. It's actually the border where slavery was supposed to end. On March 6, 1820, the Missouri Compromise set the latitude of 36 degrees 30 minutes north as the legal limit of slavery across most of the Louisiana Purchase. When Texas joined the Union in 1845 as a slave state, its claimed Panhandle stuck up past that line. To keep slavery legal and settle its debts, Texas agreed in 1850 to give up everything it held north of 3630. That surrender carved out a no-state rectangle, about 166 miles long and only 34 miles wide, that belonged to no state or territory for 40 years. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act fixed the northern edge at the 37th parallel, boxing the strip in for good. So the Panhandle's shape isn't a quirk of map-making. It's a fossil of the fight over slavery, and its southern line is exactly where that fight was drawn. 23. A piece of Colorado in Oklahoma. Drive far enough west into the Panhandle, and the state stops looking like Oklahoma and starts looking like eastern Colorado. Oklahoma State University's vegetation maps classify all three Panhandle counties as shortgrass prairie, high plains, a category set apart from the mixed grass and woodlands that cover the rest of the state. The native cover is low, warm-season grass, blue grama and buffalo grass, scattered yucca, wind-bent shrubs, and almost no trees except along the creeks. It's the same shortgrass steppe that runs through eastern Colorado and western Kansas, sitting in the rain shadow of the Rockies. That thin, dry grass built a grazing empire. At its peak, the old Anchor D Ranch ran upward of 30,000 head across some 1,500 square miles of Texas County. Most of the county. Drive east out of Boise City, and you can watch the land change. The yucca and low grass give way to taller prairie and hardwoods as you leave the dry bubble behind. Most people assume Oklahoma is one green, humid place. The Panhandle is really an ecological island, a slice of the high, dry west with wetter country on two sides. 22. The Fort Kit Carson built in no man's land. Out on the shortgrass near Lawless in Cimarron County, a low outline of tumbled stone is all that's left of a fort built by one of the most famous names in the Old West. In 1865, with the Civil War barely over, the Army sent the famous scout Kit Carson to put a post on the Cimarron cutoff of the Santa Fe Trail, the shortcut to New Mexico that ran straight across this future panhandle. The cutoff saved days, but it crossed country still ranged by Comanche and Kiowa bands, and wagon trains along it were being raided. Carson's men built Camp Nichols, a hardened camp of stone and earthworks rather than a timber stockade, to shelter and escort caravans through the most dangerous stretch. The post lasted only a few months before it was abandoned. Yet the stone outlines still sit out on private ranch land today, traced and studied by historians as a rare Santa Fe Trail military site. Most people never learned that a national trail, and one of the West's most famous names, once ran right through Oklahoma's forgotten corner. 21. The Dust Bowl's farm wife. In 1907, a Mount Holyoke graduate named Caroline Henderson gave up a teaching career to homestead near Eva in far western Texas County. Almost 30 years later, her letters from that farm taught the whole country what the Dust Bowl actually felt like. Starting in 1931, Henderson wrote a series for the Atlantic Monthly, published as Letters from the Dust Bowl. She described black clouds that blotted out the sun for days, grit sifting under the doors and into the cupboards, wheat and corn shriveled beyond saving, and neighbors losing the mortgages on farms they'd nursed for decades. This wasn't some anonymous plains homestead. It was one specific section near Eva, run by a woman who could write. In May 1936, U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Henry A. Lawless wrote to thank her for deepening the country's understanding of its farm crisis. Her letters were later collected by the University of Oklahoma Press and featured in Ken Burns's documentary. One remote panhandle farm became the human face of the whole disaster. 20. The river that leaves and returns. The Cimarron River does something borders aren't supposed to allow. It flows into the panhandle, crosses into Kansas, and then bends back into Oklahoma again. From its headwaters on a mesa in northeastern New Mexico, the Cimarron runs about 698 miles to reach the Arkansas River, a sandy, wandering channel the whole way. As it crosses Cimarron County, it swings north over the state line into Morton County, Kansas, entering about 5.5 miles above the boundary, then curves back southeast toward Oklahoma. That 698-mile run is roughly the distance from Guymon to St. Louis. For a river most people have never heard of, its looping made a mess for surveyors, who ended up drawing straight county and state lines that just cut across the bends. So Oklahoma briefly hands the river to Kansas and then takes it back downstream. On the ground, the Cimarron's ribbon of cottonwoods and cutbanks is the most obvious natural feature in an otherwise open landscape. A river that refuses to respect the map. 19. Ground zero for black blizzards. Texas County didn't just suffer through the Dust Bowl. It was one of the places the dust came from. When wheat farming replaced the shortgrass prairie and then drought hit in the 1930s, the bare soil had nothing holding it down. Black blizzards rolled across the panhandle, walls of dust hundreds of feet high that turned midday into near night. Federal surveys of the mid-1930s named western Oklahoma and Texas County among the worst wind erosion zones in the country. On April 14, 1935, Black Sunday. A dust wall swept the Panhandle so thick that people reported grit coming in through keyholes and settling in their lungs and eyes. Visibility during peak storms dropped below a single mile, like driving into dense fog, except the fog was abrasive sand. Conservation tillage and shelter belts blunt the worst of it now, but modern wind erosion maps still flag parts of Texas County. The mechanism that built the black blizzards, dry climate, exposed soil, hard southwest wind, never actually left. 18. Towns the railroad drew from scratch. Guymon and Hooker don't sit where they do because of a river or a fort. They exist because the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific decided to lay track across empty range, from liberal Kansas down to Texhoma, between 1902 and 1904. Where the crews built a depot and sidings, a town followed, and it usually took the railroad's name for it. Hooker was platted in 1904 and named for John Threlkeld, a cattle foreman for the OX Ranch who had earned the nickname Hooker years earlier out on the open range. Merchants and grain buyers set up beside the tracks. Elevators rose along the rails. The main streets ran square to the right-of-way. Look at Guymon or Hooker today, and the railroad's grip is still visible. The tracks, the elevators, and the downtown blocks all line up together. Most frontier towns grew up around a crossing or a spring. These grew up around a timetable, laid out by railroad crews on open grazing land, and still shaped like it a century later. 17. The gas field under the grass. Drive through Texas County, and you see cattle, wheat, and open sky. And miss the fact that you're standing over one of the largest natural gas fields ever found in North America. The Oklahoma Panhandle sits on the western end of the Hugoton Panhandle Field, a single connected gas reservoir that runs out of the Texas Panhandle, up through Texas County, and into southwestern Kansas. Drillers tapped it in the late 1920s, and it grew into one of the biggest gas plays on the continent, holding tens of trillions of cubic feet, enough to help heat American homes for decades. But the stranger part is what rides along with the methane: helium. Gas from this field is unusually rich in it, and for years, processing plants stripped the helium out and sold it off. So the same flat, empty-looking grassland has quietly helped supply the helium that cools MRI machines, pressurizes rockets, and fills the balloons at every kid's birthday party. Most people think the Panhandle only grows things. It also pumps them, straight up out of the ground. 16. The county touching 4 states. Stand in the right corner of Cimarron County, and you're a short drive from 4 different states at once: Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, and Kansas. Boundary datasets identify Cimarron County, at the far western tip of the Panhandle, as the only county in the entire United States whose borders touch 4 states. Colorado sits at its northwest, New Mexico along its west, Texas to the south, and Kansas across the north. From near Boise City, you could tag all 4 in an afternoon of short drives and never leave Cimarron County for another Oklahoma one. That arrangement is a leftover of how the Panhandle got surveyed. A strip about 166 miles long and only 34 wide, left as its own separate piece before Oklahoma became a state. Most counties in America touch 1 or 2 neighboring states, if any. This one quietly ties 4 of them together on open, short-grass prairie, out where almost nobody's around to notice. 15. The Cow Chip Throwing Championship. Every April, the town of Beaver holds a world championship for throwing dried cow manure as far as you can. It sounds like a joke, and it started as one. In the late 1960s, Beaver's Chamber of Commerce wanted a hook for its annual Cimarron Territory celebration, and the first organized throws happened around 1969 and 1970. But the joke rests on something real. On the treeless high plains, homesteaders in the 1800s couldn't count on firewood, so they gathered dried cattle chips to burn in their stoves. The contest turned that survival habit into a sport. Dry, flat chips, distance measured to the inch, categories for men, women, and teams. The world record still belongs to a beaver man, Robert Devers, who in 2001 flung a chip 185 feet 5 inches. The town even trademarked a mascot, King Cow Chip. In a town of about 1,500 people, where cattle reportedly outnumber residents around 16 to 1, that emblem fits. What looks like roadside kitsch is really the Panhandle, celebrating exactly what it took to survive out here. 14. The handle bigger than a state. That skinny strip on the map is a lot bigger than it looks. The 3 Panhandle counties, Cimarron, Texas, and Beaver, cover about 5,686 square miles. That's roughly 8% of all of Oklahoma, packed into a rectangle only about 34 miles wide. It looks small because it's so narrow, but it runs about 166 miles end to end. Each county is huge on its own. Texas County alone tops 2,000 square miles, bigger than Rhode Island or Delaware, and Cimarron and Beaver each clear 1,800. Put together, the Panhandle is larger than the entire state of Connecticut. Driving it east to west, from the New Mexico line to the main body of Oklahoma, is over 160 miles of nearly non-stop high plains. The handle is one of the emptiest parts of the state, but empty and small aren't the same thing. This narrow appendage quietly holds close to 1/10 of Oklahoma's land, more area than plenty of eastern regions that fill several counties on the map. 13. The skyline made of grain. In Panhandle towns like Hooker, Turpin, and Goodwell, the tallest thing for miles isn't a church or an office building. It's a grain elevator. These concrete towers rise 80 to 120 feet over 1- and 2-story streets, the height of a 9- or 10-story building, except every floor is a solid bin of wheat, corn, or sorghum. They went up beside the rail lines starting in the early 1900s to gather harvests off farms that can each run past 1,000 acres. The oldest survivor is a wood frame elevator north of Hooker, built in 1926. In peak harvests, it moved as many as 30 rail cars of wheat a day, and it's now on the National Register of Historic Places. Newer multi-bin complexes hold several million bushels at once. At harvest, trucks line up under steel dump sheds, and vertical legs lift the grain into bins towering over the town grid. In most small towns, the skyline says something about God or government. Out here, it says agriculture. The elevators are the office towers, and moving grain is the work that built the place. 12. The county seat built on a lie. Boise City, the seat of Cimarron County, exists today because of one of the boldest land swindles in Oklahoma's early history. In 1908, a Guthrie outfit called the Southwestern Immigration and Development Company, 3 men named Stanley, Klein, and Douglas, laid out a town site in the empty center of the county and sold around 3,000 lots by mail. Their brochures advertised a lush, tree-lined city with paved streets, rivers, thriving businesses, and an artesian well. Buyers in Illinois, Indiana, and Missouri sent their money sight unseen. When they arrived, they found none of it was real. No pavement, almost no trees, the nearest river miles away, and a lone windmill standing where downtown was supposed to be. The promoters didn't even hold clear title to the lots they'd sold. Federal authorities charged them with mail fraud in 1909, and Stanley and Klein were convicted and sent to the penitentiary at Leavenworth. Yet the town they conjured out of a brochure survived, grew, and became the real county seat it had only pretended to be. An entire town that started as a printed lie. 11. The prairie hiding in corners. From the air, Texas County is a grid of green circles. Center pivot irrigation, a long sprinkler arm sweeping a circle inside each square field. But look at the corners. A pivot waters a circle inside a square, which means the 4 corners never get watered. Over the decades since these systems spread in the mid-1900s, those dry corners have quietly become refuges, little patches of the original shortgrass prairie that once covered everything. Ecologists call them relict vegetation, blue grama and buffalo grass, wildflowers and yucca, holding on where the water doesn't reach, giving cover to ground-nesting birds and pollinators surrounded by crops, and quietly preserving native soil and seed banks in one of the state's most heavily farmed corners. On a single square mile section, the 4 leftover corners add up to around 140 acres, roughly a sixth of Central Park, split into 4 dry scraps. From the highway, it looks like the crops won completely. In fact, the geometry of the machines left the old prairie tucked into every corner they couldn't reach. We're into the final 10 now, and this is where the Panhandle stops being just odd and starts being impossible to forget. The strangest stories and the most human are still ahead. 10. The Roadside Geology Textbook. Driving OK 325 near Black Mesa, you pass through cuts in the hillsides that happen to slice open millions of years of history. At the top of each cut is a band of dark, hard basalt, the lava cap that makes Black Mesa a mesa, laid down 3 to 5 million years ago. Beneath it sit lighter layers of tan Dakota sandstone and dark Kiowa shale, deposited back when a shallow Cretaceous sea covered Cimarron County. You can literally trace the contact line where the basalt rests on the sandstone, a sharp boundary marking a gap of tens of millions of years between an ancient seafloor and the lava that later capped it. Nobody built these exposures for teaching. Road crews cut them for the highway and left an accidental cross-section of an ancient sea and a young volcano, readable from the shoulder at highway speed. 9. Truckers on cattle drive ruts. Some of the routes across the Panhandle were laid out by freighters and longhorns, not engineers. The best known was the Jones and Plummer Trail, blazed in 1874 by two traders, Ed Jones and Joe Plummer, to haul hides and supplies between Dodge City, Kansas, and the Texas Panhandle. It cut straight through the eastern Panhandle. The town of Beaver grew up as a stop on it, reusing older indigenous paths that already had water and grass. Texas herds bound for the Dodge City railheads followed the same corridors, wearing them deeper with every drive. When Oklahoma laid out its highway system starting in 1917, surveyors kept favoring those proven routes over cutting fresh lines across open prairie. Where a Panhandle road runs at a diagonal instead of along the section grid, it's often tracing one of those older paths. So the grain trucks on these roads today are, in a real sense, following a route picked for oxen, hides, and cattle a century and a half ago. 8. The crews that chase wheat. Every June, Texas County fills up with people who don't live there, and then empties out again. They're custom cutters, crews, often family-owned outfits from Kansas or Nebraska, who haul fleets of combines, grain trucks, and campers up the Great Plains, following the wheat as it ripens. They start in the southern plains and work north toward the Dakotas, a route that can run 1,000 to 1,500 miles in a season. When they hit the Panhandle, towns like Guymon and Hooker suddenly fill with machines cutting late into the evening under the elevator lights, and the elevator lots crowd with out-of-state plates. It's an efficient trade. Local farmers, whose operations can run several thousand acres, don't have to own enough combines for one frantic peak, and the crews string together a living from a predictable south to north sequence of jobs. Some Texas county businesses even staff up for the influx. What looks like sleepy wheat country is really a stop on a moving, continent-long harvest. 7. The town that runs on a different clock. Every town in Oklahoma keeps Central Time, except one. Out in the far northwest corner of Cimarron County, tucked against the New Mexico line beneath Black Mesa, the tiny community of Kenton quietly runs on Mountain Time, an hour behind the rest of the state. It isn't official. On paper, Kenton is central like everywhere else in Oklahoma, but almost everything the town actually deals with, the stores, the deliveries, the appointments, the neighbors, sits west of the state line in New Mexico and Colorado, where the clocks read Mountain Time. Rather than live an hour out of step with their whole world, Kettonites simply set their clocks to match. Locals tack Mountain Time onto the hour when they tell a visitor, and posted business hours end in Mountain Time or Mountain Standard Time, so nobody turns up 60 minutes early. Fewer than 3 dozen people live there now. But in a state that prides itself on running as one, this speck of the Panhandle keeps its own clock, the only community in Oklahoma that refuses to run on Oklahoma time. 6. The man who refused to leave. While Caroline Henderson wrote the letters, her husband Will made the harder decision. He stayed. On their wheat farm near Eva in Texas County, the Hendersons lived through some of the worst Dust Bowl years on record. Repeated crop failures, storms that darkened the sky, soil drifting into the fences and buildings. The popular image of the Dust Bowl is a loaded truck heading for California, and plenty of their neighbors did exactly that. Will didn't. He and Caroline had settled the claim in 1907 and poured decades of labor into its fields and buildings. Walking away meant losing all of it, and the mortgages besides. So instead, he kept planting through the drought's worst stretch, from 1934 to 1936, listing his fields against the wind, planting cover, and working with New Deal conservation programs while prices and yields stayed terrible. It was a bet that surviving the worst of it would pay off when the rain came back. It did. His stubbornness is the reason the Eva homestead was still there to save. 5. When the Panhandle was one county. For its first 17 years inside Oklahoma, the entire Panhandle was a single county, and its far corners were governed from a courthouse days away. When the federal government finally attached no man's land to Oklahoma Territory in 1890, it didn't create 3 counties, it made one giant one. First called County Number 7, and then Beaver County, stretching the full length of the strip from the Texas line nearly to Colorado. About 5,686 square miles, larger than Connecticut, under a single courthouse in the town of Beaver. A rancher near Black Mesa, in what's now Cimarron County, was legally answering to officials more than 200 miles away by road. Every court case, land filing, and tax matter for the whole strip ran through that one town at the eastern end. It stayed that way until Oklahoma became a state in 1907, when the legislature finally split the giant into Beaver, Texas, and Cimarron counties, and the far west got a government it could actually reach. 4. The man who named Guymon. The biggest town in the Panhandle is named for a businessman who gambled on a patch of dirt beside a coming railroad. In the 1890s, E.T. Guymon, a grocer, banker, and land speculator, bet that the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific would push its tracks west of the Beaver River. So he bought a section of land there and helped lay out a town site in 1900. When the railroad arrived the next year, the new stop got a post office first called Sanford, but within weeks, postal officials renamed it Guymon, honoring the man behind the town company and heading off confusion with Stratford, Texas, down the same line. The bet paid off fast. Grain elevators, stock pens, and stores clustered around the Guymon siding, pulling trade from across Texas County, and soon eclipsing older towns like Beaver. Over the next century, feedlots and a meatpacking plant grew up around that same rail and highway hub, making Guymon the Panhandle's largest town and its economic engine. A grocer's hunch about where a railroad would run is the reason the Panhandle's biggest town carries the name it does. 3. The doctor who invented a territory. In 1887, a physician named Owen Chase traveled to Washington, D.C., carrying petitions to Congress on behalf of a government that didn't officially exist. By the mid-1880s, the strip was widely called no man's land. Settlers were pouring in, but there were no courts, no laws, and no way to hold a legal land title. So in 1886, the residents took matters into their own hands and organized their own provisional government, which they named Cimarron Territory, claiming authority over the whole strip. They held an election and chose Dr. Owen G. Chase as their delegate. He went to Washington to ask Congress to recognize Cimarron Territory and give the Panhandle real legal standing. Congress simply declined to act. Chase went home to a place that remained, on paper, nobody's. And it stayed that way until the strip was folded into Oklahoma Territory in 1890. His failed trip is the perfect emblem of the Panhandle, a place so far off that its own people had to petition just to legally exist. 2. The outcrops that shelter a different world. On a landscape that looks flat and uniform, the rocky knolls and mesas around Black Mesa rise just enough to create their own little worlds. And they hide living things you'd never expect on flat grassland. Out near Kenton, in Cimarron County, the buttes, cliffs, and boulder fields break up the shortgrass monotony and create micro-habitats. Cooler, shadier, wetter pockets than the open prairie around them. Black Mesa itself tops out at 4,973 feet, within about 300 feet of Denver's famous mile-high mark. In the crevices, soil gathers and water lingers, So shrubs, cacti, and specialized grasses grow where the flat pasture can't support them. Lizards and snakes bask on the ledges. Raptors and canyon birds nest on the cliffs. North-facing slopes shelter plants that would fry in the full prairie sun and wind. Field surveys treat these outcrops as small but real reservoirs of biodiversity on an otherwise heavily grazed plain. Each one becomes a tiny refuge, a pocket of species that would vanish if the Panhandle were only the open grass it appears to be from the highway. 1. From nobody's land to center stage. We end where it all began, with a place nobody wanted. Everything on this list traces back to one strange fact. The Oklahoma Panhandle started as an orphan. When Texas gave up its claim north of the 3630 line to protect slavery, the strip was left belonging to no state and no territory. No man's land, outside the reach of any government for 40 years. And here's the thing about that emptiness. It didn't stay empty. It filled up with exactly the struggles that would come to define Oklahoma and the whole Great Plains. Indigenous nations ran it as hunting ground before any survey line touched it. Settlers wanted it so badly they invented their own territory and sent Owen Chase to beg Congress for recognition. When the Dust Bowl came, this strip was its ground zero, and a farm wife named Caroline Henderson turned one section near Eva into the human face of the entire disaster, while her husband Will refused to let the land blow away. Then the same empty corner quietly became a protein engine, feeding the country from feedlots most Americans will never see. All of it packed into a state-sized rectangle that touches 4 other states at its tip. You were told the Panhandle was the boring part, the leftover, the handle you don't think about. But a place gets called no man's land precisely because everyone is fighting over it, surviving on it, or trying to claim it. This strip isn't Oklahoma's empty edge. It's where the state's hardest history got pushed, and where, if you actually look, most of it's still hiding in plain sight. After these 35 facts about the Oklahoma Panhandle, which one got you? Drop it in the comments. If you want more high plains strangeness, watch our video on the Texas Panhandle next. Subscribe and like to keep exploring the hidden geography of America. See you in the next one.